what you were just saying about the traditions and how the Jewish people are taught. You mentioned in the book that you were kind of taught that same way. What you say is you were educated to filter. In chapter 2, you say, I was educated to filter the text, down to our traditional theology, and that the texts that disagreed or like gave some type of issue with what I thought, typically would be traditional theology, I have deemed problematic passages. Mm-hmm. And then you said after understanding in the Hebrew, Psalm 82, and some of these other passages, the worldview in which it took to make these passages cohere and understand the intent of the original author, it's like putting together like pieces of a puzzle or something where it's finally starting to fit. And I talked to Dr. John Walton. I had him on for an interview, and we kind of talked about that as well, about the intent of the original authors compared to traditions. Yep. And so you want to say a little bit about that before we move forward?
Well, I think Walton puts it really well, when he says the Bible was written for us, but not to us. It's a pithy way of communicating what ought to be the most obvious idea in the world. Hey, the biblical writers and the people they wrote their stuff to, because they all have, we talk about occasion, date, what's the purpose of this book, when we're doing hermeneutics and stuff. Okay, the biblical writers and the people they wrote to weren't us. What a shock. And not only weren't they us, they also weren't the church fathers, because the church fathers are living over a millennium later than the Old Testament. A good 2 or 3 centuries beyond the New Testament. I mean, that's like the age of our country, the United States. That's the distance between the church fathers like Augustine and the New Testament period. People don't really realize that. That's a long time. Right. But when you get over a millennium, it's like, this is ridiculous. Of course, they're not us. And none of these traditions, Catholicism, Protestantism, Puritanism, evangelicalism, charismatic movement, none of them are the biblical context. They're not the biblical writers. And so how in the world did we get to the point where we assume that the way we read the text is really the way they would read it? Okay, what we need to do is figure out how they read it, the thoughts that were going through their mind, in their world, their worldview, not just, they made pots back then. They had slings. They built walls, archaeology. No, you got to get to worldview stuff, because that's what's going through their heads. If we could figure out how they looked at what they're writing, the thoughts they were thinking in their world, then that should be our guide. Okay? It's the most obvious thing in the world. Any of us who wrote anything, if you wrote a letter to your wife, if you wrote a book, 1,000 years from now, you would want people to understand what you were thinking when you wrote it. Otherwise, they could go off in ridiculous interpretive trajectories or miss the point entirely.
Right. And I mean, I'm just saying, Bible Code 2. I knew you would get a kick out of that.
Exhibit A.
Exhibit A, exactly.
You have a number of issues that just, again, I wrote a book called The Bible Code Myth. And what I was trying to go get into in that book is all the things that you actually need to think about, and therefore all the things that just kill the Bible code. It's just dead on arrival. And let's just start from the beginning. If you're talking about the biblical period, let's just say, prior to the exile, we'll have a big chunk of time before the 6th century BC, before the Jews, what's left of the 12 tribes are taken into captivity in Babylon. prior to that time, they're using what scholars would call the epigraphic Hebrew script, or Paleo-Hebrew script, the Paleo lettering forms, okay? Because that's what Hebrew, that's how it was written. We have texts outside the Bible from the same periods that show, again, just a dramatic difference in the way the letters appeared. And that this changes over time, and eventually during the exile, it gets adapted to what we think of as Hebrew today, what we call the block letter script, or the block letter style. But that wasn't original.